Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
So, jam tomorrow or even today? That was the question Westminster wanted answered by Chancellor Philip Hammond as he delivered his autumn statement in the wake of the Prime Minister's pledge to help families who were just about managing. Mr Hammond made clear that the public finances would be hit by the Brexit vote, abandoning his predecessor's target of reaching a budget surplus by the end of the decade and admitting the need for higher borrowing in the short term. This would help finance £23 billion worth of infrastructure spending on homes, transport and innovation. While there were no headline tax rises, the Chancellor signalled a crackdown on middle-class pay perks, a tweak to national insurance and a rise in insurance premium tax. There was the expected 30p an hour rise in the national living wage from next April, as well as confirmation of higher tax thresholds by the end of the decade and a slight reduction in the amount families will lose in universal credit as they earn more. Our political editor, Gary Gibbon, looks at how much difference the plans will make to Theresa May's just about managing families.
Philip Hammond didn't stop for the photographers. He didn't wave his autumn statement document around. Maybe because it takes British national debt to nearly £2 trillion. The Chancellor, who supported Remain, believes many of his problems are created by Brexit. He thinks the worst is yet to come, when investors hesitate and markets are buffered by months of Brexit negotiations.
No! Brexit!
Outside the Commons, a demonstration by Brexit supporters who sniff betrayal and backsliding at every turn. Inside, the Chancellor read out the Independent Office for Budget Responsibility's assessment of what Brexit will mean for the country's books.
While the OBR is clear that it cannot predict the deal the UK will strike with the EU, its current view is that the referendum decision means that potential growth over the forecast period is likely to be 2.4 percentage points lower than would otherwise have been the case. The OBR acknowledges that there is a higher degree of uncertainty around these figures than usual.
Mr Hammond said he now needed to bust apart his predecessor's promises on borrowing.
In view of the uncertainty facing the economy and in the face of slower growth forecasts, we no longer seek to deliver a surplus in 2019-20. But the Prime Minister and I, Mr Speaker, remain firmly committed to seeing the public finances return to balance as soon as practicable, while leaving enough flexibility to support the economy in the near term.
Heavy with sarcasm, his colleagues call him box office Phil, never knowingly overexcited. Here are the year-on-year borrowing figures George Osborne projected when he was Chancellor in his budget only in March this year. The deficit disappears, as promised in the Tory manifesto in 2020. Today's numbers show borrowing continuing to be high. The deficit persists. It's £122 billion higher over the Parliament. And the Office for Budget Responsibility helpfully spells out it thinks that nearly £60 billion of the extra debt is due to the impact of Brexit.
£58 billion of the worsening in the public finances is due to the Brexit decision. Isn't this a salutary warning to us about the decisions we take in the coming months and years? And isn't it a very strong argument for us remaining as close as possible to our largest trading area, the single market, and inside, not outside, the customs union?
The OBR are probably still quite wrong about 2017. Their forecast is too low, their borrowing forecast far too high, and we will get good access to the single market once we're out of the EU.
The Chancellor spending some of his new borrowing on infrastructure and investment projects. And in Treasury terms, not much more than small change is going to restoring the cuts in universal credit and other working age benefits due to hit the just about managing families, or JAMs.
The Chancellor had a choice, really, a limited amount of money available. He could have put that into the pockets of people not doing very well in the labour market at the moment, or he could have put it in capital spending. He's decided to go for the capital spending. He's decided for the jam tomorrow rather than jam today.
and the Treasury effectively wins over the politics of number 10.
Couldn't possibly comment.
The squeeze has not been lifted from the poor. The screw of the welfare cap has not been turned off. This has simply made a brutal regime slightly less brutal.
We've had a month of briefing from the party opposite on those people who are called just about managing, the jams. To the party opposite, these people are just an electoral demographic. To us, they're our friends, our neighbours and the people we represent.
Great changes can occur. Change has got to come. People voted for change, and a change is going to come.
Theresa May last month at her party conference. Today was the first set-piece occasion to unveil big change. And it seems the revolution has been postponed.
In some ways, actually, Philip Hammond is quite similar to George Osborne in the sense that he has talked tough today on the public finances, but really what he's done is accept quite a lot of extra borrowing, and that is the big picture of what is going on.
One change was signalled today. Philip Hammond hinted he might go hunting in new fields for savings in years to come, perhaps ending the protected status of pensioners' benefits and the ring-fencing of NHS spending. Not perhaps the change many voters hoped Theresa May had in mind.
Well, Gary is in Westminster. Gary, not an earth-shattering autumn statement, but it's pretty clear he's crossed a Rubicon.
Well, I think what Philip Hammond wanted to do was keep his powder dry. He's not very optimistic about Brexit privately when he speaks to people, and he thinks that it's going to bring trouble around the corner. There'll be lots of bumps in the road once we're into the negotiation phase, and he thinks he might well need that headroom he was talking about in his speech later. I think one of the other great takeaways from this is the cost of Brexit being spelt out by the Office for Budget Responsibility. By the way, they think that reducing migration, not to the tens of thousands, they pointedly don't think the government will manage to do that, but reducing net migration from the EU will actually be part of that cost of Brexit, about 16 billion, they say. All that estimate has played in, as you could see from the voices in Parliament there, into the debate about what sort of Brexit we want. And that's going to carry on. There's a lot of criticism of the OBR tonight from Brexit supporters. And interestingly, some thoughts coming from the EU 27, those staying inside. One EU diplomat said to me tonight, looking at the growth and borrowing figures, a few chickens are coming home to roost. So at least someone's smiling, albeit not very warmly.
Well, now, in the West Midlands, up there in Smethwick, is our business editor, Siobhan Kennedy. You're in the engine room of British activity. What's the reaction?
John, the rollers are still humming here behind me as the night shift turns out steel, the majority of which is destined for Britain's house-building industry. Now, this manufacturer is in the West Midlands, an area referred to by Theresa May as the Midlands engine, but which also voted for Brexit despite all the uncertainties that came with that vote. Now today, the Chancellor Philip Hammond made clear that it's the efficiency and productivity of manufacturers like these that will be vital in helping Britain counter the new double whammy of slower growth and higher spending post-Brexit that his own economists are now predicting. The canals that crisscross Birmingham and the Black Country were once the arteries of this industrial powerhouse. That heyday has now passed, but the government wants industry here to play a bigger part in Britain's economic future. But then came Brexit. Manufacturers like this steelmaker were chuntering along just fine until June, when Britain voted to leave the EU. Yes, the pound has fallen since, so short-term orders are up. But with costs also rising, the future looks much more uncertain.
A major investment decision now would be predicated upon an understanding of our trading relationship both with Europe and with the rest of the world. And we don't have that at the moment. That will emerge, and at that point, larger decisions will, I'm sure, be taken.
But with our debt forecast to peak at over 90% next year,
he's just one business, but scale that up with tens of thousands of companies delaying investment, and the economy's got a big problem. So he was keen to hear what the Chancellor had to say.
Today's OBR forecast is for growth to be 2.1%.
Philip Hammond was upbeat as he talked of seizing the opportunity ahead, but just take a look at these figures. Only in March, the Office for Budget Responsibility predicted business investment would grow by 2.6% this year. Now that forecast has been slashed to minus 2.2%. There's an even bigger drop to come next year as investment tumbles to minus 0.3% from a forecast of 6.1% in March. And that fall is predicted to continue until the end of the decade. And it's that above everything else that is dragging down UK growth. So the Chancellor broke the rules today. After years of a relentless focus on deficit reduction, this Chancellor decided to spend. Not very much, but what he did spend was primarily focused on huge infrastructure projects like roads and housing to try and get manufacturers like this one moving. Those measures include a £23 billion National Productivity Fund, a £2.3 billion housing infrastructure fund, and cuts to corporation and business rates.
So how pleased were you with what the Chancellor had to say?
I think we'd be very pleased with the comments he's made about infrastructure, about the development of innovation and productivity, all of which are really important to us.
How certain can he be, though, of his own forecasts?
Well, I think for all of us in business, he can't be, because we are still uncertain as to exactly what the trading relationships are going to be with the rest of the world. But business's job is to get on with it anyway.
Ordinary people have to as well, but government forecasters predicted they too will stop spending as inflation bites. So the Chancellor had some giveaways to help those they believe are just about managing the jams. A freeze in fuel duty, more housing and retaining more in-work benefits.
In terms of building new homes will definitely help, basically, although it's not on a large scale, but I understand that actually about 50,000 houses are going to be built, which will help.
It's hard, it is, but all I do is just keep going, work and work and work. I pay my taxes and that's it, but they should be helping us because we are paying a lot of taxes and it's not right.
Did you feel that the government was trying to help?
Yeah, I found it helpful because obviously with the kids now it's really difficult. So, you know, when you're earning a certain amount, they're also helping with the tax as well.
This was a budget intended to get places like this moving again, but with so much uncertainty ahead, the Chancellor knows he may yet need to dig even deeper if his long-term plan is to work.
Siobhan Kennedy in Smethwick in the West Midlands. So the Office for Budget Responsibility says that Brexit will result in £58.7 billion of extra borrowing over the next 5 years, with the economy set to be 2.4% smaller than it otherwise would have been. But what does it all mean? Our business correspondent Helia Ebrahimi is here. Helia.
Well, John, that's the Brexit bill that's essentially forced government to abandon George Osborne's obsession with surplus targeting and instead adopt a new set of fiscal rules that have given Mr Hammond much more headroom to borrow. And he's done that to the tune of £122 billion. But let's take a look at why he's had to do that. If you rewind to March, the OBR was forecasting that UK growth would be above 2% in each of the next 3 years. Well, today they were much more pessimistic. And specifically, if you look at 2017, they've slashed growth by more than a third. Now, if we shift that across to government debt number, we know the Chancellor thinks this is eye-watering. Well, today we've found out it really is, because it's hitting above £1.95 trillion. Now, these levels of debt, in terms of debt to GDP, haven't been seen since, you know, in the last 50 years, basically, and they're the kind of thing that would have made Mr Hammond's predecessor balk. Remember, Mr Osborne used to say anything above 90% would damage the economy permanently.
Well, now, is this actually stimulus or is it austerity?
Well, that's an interesting point, because strictly speaking, it's a giveaway budget, but, you know, it's modest. If you tot it all up, it adds up to more than £33 billion of stimulus over Parliament. But what's interesting is that, as Siobhan was saying, most of that is infrastructure investment. That's gone up 35%. So it's not money that has gone to jams. That's the just about managing group in society that the Prime Minister is very keen on. Instead, there's almost a whiff of Keynesianism about this autumn statement, because essentially what Mr Hammond's done is borrow to invest. Now, where has that left the jam? Not very happy, I'm afraid. They've been more squeezed than ever, and the OBR is predicting now that inflation will catch up to earnings by next year, basically meaning that real incomes stall, so the money people have in their paycheck will buy them less in the supermarket. So while Mr Hammond may have said at the Tory party conference that people haven't voted for Brexit to be poorer, today's forecasts paint a very different picture.
Hello, Ibrahimi. Kathy.
Thanks, John. We're joined now by the Financial Secretary to the Treasury, Jane Ellison, and Labour's Shadow Business Secretary, Clive Lewis. Jane Ellison first. When the OBR says that an extra £226 million worth a week of borrowing is down to Brexit, entirely down to Brexit, is that the experts indulging in Project Fear again?
Well, look, the OBR are an independent forecaster. They have made their forecast. They've explained how they've done that. They've looked at a range of economic data available, and they've said they think that that is the impact on, principally on investor confidence over the next few years as we go through a period of uncertainty.
So you don't think they're being overly gloomy, as some of your own MPs do?
We have to respond to the forecast they've made. I think they've tried to take, they've said in their own explanation that there are things that they can't know, but they've tried to make a realistic estimate
so it could be even worse,
the challenges that we face, and we have to respond to that. Now,
so it could be even worse,
but
though,
they've also...
once Brexit actually happens.
The OBR have made their forecasts and we're responding to them. But it is important to note that even despite those uncertainties, they forecast the economy keeps growing through the period.
Clive Lewis, now that you know what the OBR thinks post-Brexit the landscape will look like, will Labour MPs try to ensure that it's as soft a Brexit as possible, for example, by blocking leaving the single market?
We've been quite clear that we want to see access to the single market, and if that's tariff-free access,
unfettered access,
we want to see access to the single market. That's the starting point where we start from. But I just wanted to get into those OBR figures and the £122 billion that's been added on to the debt in terms of the deficit. And I think what's clear here is that yes, half of that is because of the impact of Brexit, but let's not forget the other half is because of the 6 years of economic failure that this government has been responsible for. Productivity, some of the worst in the OECD. It takes us a third longer to make a product than it does in Germany, in France, in Italy. This is appalling, and you've had 6 years to get this right. And
so the productivity problems predated Brexit?
Yeah, absolutely. And look, the Chancellor has always said that tackling our long-term productivity gap is one of his real priorities. And, that's very much a large part of what was announced today with the new National Infrastructure Fund. Some of the things he was announcing, for example, stimulating more the links between science and innovation, some of the sort of house-building money, strategic infrastructure, connectivity, all of those things are directly intended to address that productivity gap.
But Brexit did loom over this. And, you refused to tell the OBR, for example, if your promises to Nissan created extra financial liabilities. Will you come clean on that now?
Well, look, the Secretary of State and Clive debated that in Parliament
at
some length.
Let's try and get an answer now.
At some length, and the Secretary of State was quite clear no checkbooks were involved. But what he did say when he was answering Clive was he made the point that he'd said to Nissan, he'd given assurances about the commitment of our country to, investing in great science, investing in innovation, investing in infrastructure. And that's exactly what you saw from the Chancellor today.
Can we just say, when we talk about investing in infrastructure, the figures of 30 odd billion pounds that Philip Hammond has invested, let's not forget, when the last Labour government left in 2010, it was investing around about 3.4% of GDP into investment. When George Osborne left, he was investing about 2.2% of GDP in investment. After Philip Hammond sat down today, we're investing 2% of our GDP into investment. Now, when he stood up and said he wanted to get our country, our economy match fit ready, I had Andy Murray in my head. But when he sat down, I had Eddie the Eagle Edwards. Because, quite frankly, this highlights quite clearly how much of a failure the last 6 years have been. You should have been investing 6 years ago, not trying to cut your way out of the deficit. You should have been investing, and now we're all paying the price for it.
Austerity was supposed to last 5 years. It's going to last 15, at least.
Well, clearly we've had, with the Brexit decision, a very significant economic event to which we've had to respond. But just taking Clive's point on, I don't accept this. I think Labour are really getting this wrong. What the OBR show is actually, in the figures that they've got in today's report, the underlying strength of the economy, the fact that despite what's going to be, a big change, a period of uncertainty, that the economy continues to grow.
Well, underlying strength, that debt is going to pass 90% of GDP, which is
That
why
our
George
economy-
Osborne said there were highly significant risks of large negative impact on growth.
Indeed, and the Chancellor has said those debt figures are going to be very high. But
do you agree with large negative impact?
But debt continues to
On
fall.
growth?
Debt will fall towards the end of this Parliament, continue to fall. As a
But do
percentage
you
of
agree with
GDP.
George Osborne's assessment that there's a real risk of a large negative impact on growth with that debt figure?
Look, we're going into a period of uncertainty around which there are a number of risks. The job of the Chancellor, supported by the rest of the government, is to manage those risks and to respond intelligently in a balanced and flexible way to them. It's exactly what you saw him doing today in the Commons.
The problem with this is that twice as many people trust Theresa May as Jeremy Corbyn on the economy. So you can't help any of these just about managing families that Theresa May talks about unless you get back into government.
That's quite true. And I think with a few autumn statements like this, I think we'll see those statistics change. I think clearly the thing for me that hasn't been picked up today is that it's not just the kind of 1.9 trillion potentially of public sector debt. Let's not forget there's another 1.5 trillion of private household debt. That's where government has cut back. And to make up the shortfall, people have had to borrow. So I think out there at home, there are lots of figures flying around, but people know when it comes to elderly social care, the £4.5 billion hole in the elderly social care budget, the 22 billion hole in the NHS, wages stagnating, productivity down. I think people at home will know what's actually happened here. Their gut will tell them.
Clive Lewis, Jane Ellison, thank you very much for joining me.
Every few years we get a budget or autumn statement that has to break bad news to the nation, and being no doubt today was one of those occasions. It looks like we're going to be a long way from where we thought we'd be at the end of the Parliament. The forecasts have been revised, and the government is about £17 billion poorer in 2020 than it was anticipating. What a stubborn old beast borrowing is turning out to be.
Of the uncertainty facing the economy and in the face of slower growth forecasts, we no longer seek to deliver a surplus in 2019-20. But the Prime Minister and I, Mr. Speaker, remain firmly committed to seeing the public finances return to balance as soon as practicable, while leaving enough flexibility to support the economy in the near term.
Flexibility. In other words, fiscal control means what the Chancellor says it'll mean. No running commentary, just trust the government to deliver. Now, we don't need to run a government surplus, so don't worry about that target being kicked into the distance. The real problem is the lack of a plan for hitting the less ambitious goal for 2020. And frankly, for me, it is today that we have to declare the idea of cutting spending to balance the books can truly be said to be dead. Welfare cuts have been put into reverse today. They've gone too far, apparently. Extra money's been thrown at prisons today. The cuts there have gone too far as well. And have a look at this graph, because this sort of nails the point I'm trying to make. The day-to-day spending of government departments measured per capita and how it's planned over this Parliament. The government still hopes to shrink spending, and if you look at it accumulating over the Parliament, actually about a 7% reduction over to 2021. Now look at what they've achieved this year. Basically nothing at all. Can they really say this is the deficit reduction plan if they've overspent this year and not managed to cut? The truth is we have a stubborn deficit, and salami-slicing spending no longer looks plausible as a solution. Right, now the second story of the day is how we got into that, and a lot of it is Brexit. At least that's what the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, says.
While the OBR is clear that it cannot predict the deal the UK will strike with the EU, its current view is that the referendum decision means that potential growth over the forecast period is likely to be 2.4 percentage points lower than would otherwise have been the case.
Well, taking 2.4% out of our economy doesn't sound like that much, but that is the OBR view of the cost of Brexit. And when I said there was £17 billion of bad news in the forecast for the last year of the Parliament, 15 billion of those were the bill for Brexit. So the declining fiscal position and the EU debate are where the politics are. Our political editor Nick Watt has been soaking it all up in Westminster today.
On a chilly autumn day, the nation's spirits were momentarily lifted when Philip Hammond found a spare £7.6 million to save a jewel in the nation's heritage. If Philip Hammond had Jane Austen in mind, some may have seen his autumn statement as more reminiscent of a darker genre. To them, it was the revenge of the experts. We thought we'd seen them off in the referendum.
I think the people in this country have had enough of experts.
But today, the capo de capi of the experts hovered over the autumn statement. The warning by Robert Choate of the Office for Budget Responsibility that the costs of Brexit would account for half of the £122 billion increase in government borrowing set the framework for Philip Hammond's first big event as Chancellor. Leave supporters were not happy.
I think the OBR, the Office for Budget Responsibility, is extremely reasonable in the approach it's taken, but wrong. That is to say, it assumes that if we leave, when we leave the European Union, we will apply the same tariffs to the rest of the world as we currently apply. Well, that would be a lunatic thing to do. Half of the benefit of leaving the EU is we can set our own tariffs. But until the government has developed its negotiating strategy and explained it, the OBR can only operate on a status quo assumption. So they're perfectly rational in what they're doing, but it is not what the reality will be.
And about those experts?
There's a great line from Cicero about there's nothing so absurd that it hasn't been said by some philosopher. And I think suspicion of experts goes back into antiquity, and it's a very healthy thing to have. Experts, soothsayers, astrologers are all in much the same category.
But Remain supporters say the Brexit vote hangs over everything.
There are three problems that the autumn statement is trying to address: Brexit, Brexit and Brexit, whether it's to do with business investment, whether it's to do with trading prospects, or the kind of austerity that is now going to be continuing because of the hit to revenues and tax receipts that we're going to see. It's going to cloud everything, no matter what government department you're in, no matter what area of the public services.
From the moment he was appointed Chancellor, Philip Hammond always knew he would have to use this autumn statement to reset the economic dial after the Brexit vote. But the scale of the challenge was laid out in stark terms by the independent experts of the Office for Budget Responsibility, who said that by 2021, the UK's £2 trillion economy will be noticeably smaller than it would have been without the referendum, and there will be a slowing in the pace of export and import growth over 10 years. In a break with his predecessor, the Chancellor nodded to John Maynard Keynes by announcing that he would throw a protective arm around the economy by borrowing an extra £23 billion over the next 5 years to fund new investment projects. To some, this had a familiar feel.
Well, it is a sort of parallel universe, one of those kind of sliding doors moments where you think, back at the last election, we were saying, as Labour, we would come in and balance the current budget, get it into surplus over the lifetime of the Parliament. Well, it looks as though Philip Hammond and the Conservatives aren't even going to be able to do that.
So one story in our house did come to an end today. George Osborne's grand plan to fix the roof by balancing the books was laid to rest, at least for the moment. The deficit will still be here until well into the next decade, and Britain's overall debt mountain is creeping ever upwards. So modest measures today for the so-called jams, people who are just about managing, and the Chancellor offered no guarantees beyond 2020 on two landmark spending pledges, the triple lock for pensioners and the ring-fencing of the NHS budget. One Tory believes the party's fundamental goals remain on track.
The trajectory set out by George Osborne that hasn't met the precise time frame has been the right one, and Mr Hammond is continuing with that. So no, the Tory principle of sound money retains its validity.
Perhaps the plotline in our House will surprise us again. The experts have left open the possibility that the economy will eventually rebound. The fate of a generation of politicians will depend on how the story ends.
Nick, what there? Well, David Gauke, the Chancellor's right-hand man in the Treasury, is here with me. Very good evening to you.
Good evening.
This 2.4% shrinkage in the economy relative to the, if we'd voted to remain in the referendum, is that a kind of figure that you think is reasonable and a sensible figure to be planning?
Well, look, I think we have an independent body that makes the forecasts, and I think it is sensible for a government to work on the basis that that independent body has got it right. And it's not out of line with most independent commentators. Actually, the Bank of England has a more pessimistic view on these things. So I think we have to work on the basis that the OBR is right. It's their analysis, not ours, but we work on the basis that
it's right. Not that out of line with what the Treasury was saying the cost of Brexit would be before the referendum, and everyone said that was Project Fear.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, you must feel to some extent, I suppose, a little bit vindicated by seeing the OBR completely independently, nothing to do with the Treasury work, come out, look at it again after the referendum and come up with a figure that wasn't quite as pessimistic as the Treasury one, but in the same ballpark.
Well, frankly, I would rather we were in a position where the economy was growing very strongly, and yeah, that's more important to say than the debate of who was right over what. But I don't think anyone should be surprised that, given there's some uncertainty, given that there's a transitional period that we would go through, that there would be a hit to growth of some scale. And the OBR have made their assessment as to what it is.
And obviously some of your colleagues are saying this is too pessimistic. Some of them have had less kind words about the OBR, and these guys are Remainers, you know, and all of that kind of stuff. Would you just tell them to shut up? We have to accept what the OBR says then.
Well, I think, you showed a clip from Jacob, but also from Ian Duncan Smith, and he said, well, government's got to prepare for the worst as well. So, in the end, I think we have, as a government, we have to respond to what the OBR says. People, of course, are entitled to their opinion, and I guess in a year or two's time, we can look back and see who was right and who was wrong.
One of the very striking things about it is that if you want to help the jams, the just about managings, if you want to help the people who aren't even managing, Brexit, if we believe the OBR, swamps everything you're doing, doesn't it? You can tinker around the edges, but there's this blooming great 17 billion or so, 15 billion, caused by Brexit, which is just so much more significant. We wonder why you don't say to those people, wouldn't you like to think again about Brexit?
Well, you're tempting me into rerunning the arguments of the referendum. We had a referendum. I was on the Remain side, but we lost. And actually, if I remember rightly, on the eve of the referendum, I think you made the point that the arguments were brought out to the British people about the economic risks, but also, in terms of issues of immigration. Those arguments were made. The British people made a decision. We have to respect that and implement it, and that's where we are, rather than trying to sort of pick at the scab, if you like, right. Pick at the wound and reopen that whole argument.
Okay, let's talk about the budget surplus target. Let's have a look at a poster now. This is a poster that was used during the last Parliament. It was actually used in the 2014. I think this is Labour isn't learning. Labour still plan to increase debt by an extra 3,200 per person. We were trying to do the calculation. I don't know how that 3,200 was calculated, but 2018-19, your debt will be an extra 4,600 per person, bigger than we were told at the general election less than two years ago. Now, do you want to apologise to the British people for the campaign that was run and the claims that were made at that time?
No. Let's look at, your question is predicated upon the OBR numbers that were set out today. Without wanting to go back to the referendum, I do think we do need to understand, what has changed. We fought the last general election with a pledge to get into surplus by the end of the Parliament. What the Office of Budget Responsibility have said today is we're not going to meet that pledge. They also say, if you look through the numbers, that but for their analysis of the costs of Brexit. Actually, we would have delivered that in 2019-20. Yeah, things have changed, circumstances have changed. Now the question is, how does the government respond to that? In these new circumstances, again, to come back to John Maynard Keynes, the facts have changed, the circumstances have changed.
So Brexit is to blame. We would have met a surplus, we would have had a surplus, but for Brexit.
That's what the OBR is saying today.
Yeah, because you would have had a small surplus, you were saying, at the end of the last election, and Brexit has more than wiped that out.
Yeah, that's what the OBR is saying.
So you don't feel a need to apologise for the claims that you were making in the last election, even though we have a Conservative government implementing its manifesto pledges. People at the time, by the way, said it's going to be very difficult for you to meet those. And I think there's a sense now that Brexit is a bit of a cover for the fact that you don't have the stomach to deliver some of the decisions that would be necessary to actually make a surplus.
Well, again, I come back to, as part of that OBR analysis today, what they show is, although I'm not for a moment saying that all of the deterioration in the public finances is down to do, because it isn't all, but notwithstanding that, we still would have made that 2019-20 surplus number. Right. So the question is,
folks, you can't use it as, you can't say the OBR, you're accepting the OBR position.
Yeah.
You need to tell the public, folks, we would have a surplus, except that you voted for Brexit. The Chancellor didn't spell it out that clearly today. He seemed to be disguising the Brexit effect in everything he was saying about the difficult circumstances, lower revenues and challenging growth. I mean, the public should be told. We would have a surplus.
I mean, the OBR have done that, and I'm saying this is OBR numbers. It's not government numbers. It's not the Treasury numbers. That's what the OBR is saying.
Brexit is the excuse.
But it's not the excuse. But you made the question where you've not made the decisions to do it. Actually, we have made some difficult decisions on spending, which over the course of the last 6 years, actually the spending side of things have been delivered. We haven't overspent.
Well, let's have a look, because I just put up the graph I put in my initial remarks. So this is the way it has to fall during the rest of this Parliament. And we can see it didn't fall this year. So this year, more or less, we've held it flat. You're expecting it to fall by 7% to meet these new softer ambitions. How on earth are you going to deliver 7% cuts in spending? And why, if you can deliver 7%, could you not do it this year? You were meant to make some cuts and you didn't make any this year, so you overshot this year, and you're now expecting to make 7%. That is your plan for deficit reduction, isn't it?
Well, I think one of the reasons why you've got the profile for this year is that we've particularly front-loaded the extra money that's gone into the NHS. So that's one of the reasons why that kink is in there. But I come back to the point. Look at what we've done over the last 6 years.
Well, I'd rather look at what you've done over the last year. You haven't managed to get spending down. And the reason you trucked money into the NHS this year is because you knew that the thing was imploding if you didn't put the money into it. It wasn't because you felt like it. It's in a great difficulty.
It's part of, with the NHS, we're putting in the £10 billion over this Parliament. We decided to front-load that, and that's why that kink is there. But look, the point I want to make, Evan, is that rightly people are making the point that you're not reducing the deficit in the way that you said you would. That isn't because we have failed to deliver the spending cuts that we've set out. You can go back to the summer budget of 2010, and people said these are very, very difficult spending cuts. Are you going to be able to deliver? Actually, we have, and over that period of time, we have seen 8 out of 10 children go to good or outstanding schools. Crime has come down.
On the upside. But are you really telling me you think you can get 7% out of the over the next 5 years? You didn't mean to keep it flat this year. It had been intending to go down. This was the easiest year of the Parliament. You missed. And now everything for deficit reduction is predicated on steeper falls than you failed to achieve this year. And that is our deficit reduction plan.
Well, our record, I mean, you've looked at that year, but you can look at the previous 5 years where we successfully delivered on the departmental spending reductions that we've done in a period of time, as I say, you can look at the children as...
It gets harder, not easier, as time goes on. You've taken the low-hanging fruit. Now you're going to get 7% with none of the low-hanging fruit left because you picked it all in the first Parliament?
Not necessarily, because what you can do is, and I think we are succeeding in doing, is building up more of a culture of spending control, that you can start making reforms to public services that bring long-term reforms. I'll give you an example, if I may.
Briefly.
The area I used to be involved with, HMRC, have actually done some fairly fundamental reforms as to how they deliver services. They have reduced costs. They are collecting more in tax. Actually, in recent year or so, they've improved customer services as well. So I do believe public sector reform is possible. You can get more for less.
David Gauke, thank you very much indeed. Well, obviously, the Labour Party has not been a supporter of the whole austerity strategy at all and takes the view that it's been futile. Would we now be borrowing less if we'd borrowed more in the last Parliament? Well, this was the gist of the criticism of Shadow Chancellor John McDonnell.
Today, we've seen the very people the Prime Minister promised to champion betrayed. The Chancellor has failed to break with the economic strategy of austerity. The country remains unprepared and ill-equipped to meet the challenges of Brexit and secure Britain's future as a world-leading economy. After all the sacrifices people have made over the last 6 years, I fear today's statement has laid the foundations for more wasted years.
Well, let's talk to Rebecca Long-Bailey. She's the Shadow Chief Secretary of the Treasury, speaks for Labour. Do you think they've got a plan for getting the deficit down?
Well, we haven't seen a plan so far. I mean, they told us they were going to eradicate the deficit by 2015, and I think the figures that we've seen today have been absolutely shocking.
Do you think it is plausible they can cut spending in ways that are acceptable by the amount that the OBR says we have to assume they're going to in order to make the books add up to where they add up now, as let alone where they were meant to add up to?
I think some of the important points to note, and I was listening to your conversation with David, is there was a lot of emphasis on Brexit, and the OBR report actually points out that of the £122 billion cumulative deficit figure that we're going to see by 2021, it's only £59 billion that actually forms, is directly attributable to Brexit. So the rest of it is as a result of the government's mismanagement with the finances. So we don't think they've taken a responsible approach to deficit reduction, and we don't think that they've set up our economy for the future.
Right. You agree that borrowing is too high at the moment. I mean, it needs to come down, maybe not right away, but it has to come down, right? We're not going to sit at where we are, correct?
Yeah.
And you don't probably need a surplus. I mean, that was an ambitious target, but you're not aiming at a surplus.
I think every government responsibly should aim for a surplus, but I think the strategy that the government put forward wasn't achievable, and we pointed that out to them at the time.
OK, so eventually aiming for a surplus. We're clearly borrowing way more than a surplus now. What basically has to happen to get that down? Because we're either spending too much or we're taxed too little, and I just wonder which one you think it is.
Well, there's a number of factors that are involved in this. I mean, certainly if Labour had been in power since 2010, we wouldn't be in the situation that we're in today, because we would have invested in infrastructure, invested in industry, and provided the high-skilled, high-paid jobs that would have returned to the exchequer in taxes. We would have clamped down on tax avoidance. I think the government has very warm words when it comes to tax avoidance.
So
there's very little in terms of action, I'm afraid, on that front.
So you would have had more growth, essentially, you think, and more investment, and so somehow you would have borrowed more and we would have less borrowing now as a result. But that's not where we're starting. So we're starting with a higher level of borrowing than you're comfortable with. You've said you think we should aim at a surplus, if not necessarily hit it. And I come back to the point, what is your plan for eradicating the surplus? Let's suppose you want to do it by 2025, right? What is your plan? Is it tax?
No, you have to. Well, you separate your capital spending from your public spending to start off with, and that forms part of our fiscal credibility rule, which has been put together in conjunction with world economists. So, in terms of public spending, which is your tax receipts, I think we need a more efficient tax system. I think a number of decisions that were taken by the government, for example, slashing corporate capital gains tax, slashing inheritance tax, and flip-flopping about on corporation tax, weren't the right decisions to take. I think the cuts that they've implemented in terms of universal credit in particular and ESA RAG is the latest one. People look to lose up to £30 a week who are sick and disabled.
That's not a deficit reduction plan. I can see why you want to do it.
There are more responsible spending and tax decisions that you could take. And as I've said, we wouldn't have slashed the certain taxes that they have slashed so far. I think we do need to have a look at a more progressive tax system.
Okay. So more tax, and particularly for the rich.
not necessarily more tax, better tax.
Sorry, Rebecca, if it isn't more tax, then it's not a solution.
Well, let me
to the
give you an
deficit
example.
problem,
Let me give you an example. There's a number of tax reliefs that the government applied to a number of different groups. Now, at the last count, I asked for statistics from the government a few weeks ago, and they had over 200 tax reliefs that they could provide no economic data on at all. We don't know whether they're efficient. We don't know whether they're helping individuals or people. We have no data. So we need to assess our current tax base to make sure that that's working efficiently, and then we look at other options. Now,
very quick last one. Pensioner triple lock. Philip Hammond kind of hinted today that has to be looked at, won't be in the next Parliament or in the next Tory manifesto. Would you also abandon the pensioner triple lock?
I think it's shocking, and I think our pensioners are being sold out by this government. I think pensions in particular need to be looked very carefully at by the government, because essentially people signed up to a social contract with the government, and we've got the example of the Women Against State Pension Age at the moment having the goalposts moved.
So you wouldn't touch all of that? You wouldn't touch
Well,
that.
I think the government needs to take a responsible approach and realise that people need to be sustained in their old age. Another point I would make, Evan, and this is linked to today's statement. Another point I would make, and it's about social care. I think there was nothing today in the autumn statement about social care at all, and I was absolutely shocked, because I know the government came under a lot of pressure, and if we're talking about care that's attributed to the older generation in particular, they've been sold out on this.
Rebecca Long-Bailey, thanks very much indeed.
Thanks a lot, Evan.
We'll come back to the autumn statement a little later in the programme. Back to the autumn statement. Now, these occasions tend to be very political. It's tempting to say that today's was less so. Spreadsheet Phil was unflashy, no cash, no flash. But in a funny sort of way, that is politic too. The Chancellor wanting to adopt what looks like a more sober tone. He slipped in a few jokes, although perhaps aimed at Westminster and unlikely to get the folks of Middlesbrough guffawing in the aisles. So how is the public feeling right now at our post-Brexit prospects? Katie Razzle has been in and around Middlesbrough South. That's a Labour constituency that the Tories might hope to gain. And she's been listening to how people there are feeling about the future.
I've been in here now for about 4 weeks. Basically boarding and plastering.
Tough work?
Yeah, very tough work, yeah.
Jonathan Skelton moved into plastering after he lost his job when the SSI steelworks closed at Redcar.
When I was employed at SSI, you didn't have to worry, you had a regular wage. Now, because you've got to look for work, it's a lot more difficult. My wife works, but I've got 2 kids to support as well, you know, so you're continually worrying about it, money. I'll go without if it means my kids haven't.
Newsnight first met Mr Skelton in a classroom just before the referendum. In amongst the younger students, he and a group of redundant steelworkers were being retrained. All of them supported Brexit.
How many of you are thinking of voting out?
According to George Osborne, we're supposed to be in a depression now, not a recession, a depression. You know, all these scaremongering that went on before Brexit, the country's thriving as far as I can see.
In 2017, the OBR forecasts growth to slow to 1.4%.
This radio's usually tuned to music, but today we turned it to politics.
All of a sudden they can produce billions and billions of pounds when one minute they're telling us they've got no money to do anything with, and then they can invest £23 billion in something. I mean, what do they take us for fools?
The stark predictions on the cost of Brexit fall on deaf ears here. But good news for the Conservatives. Jeremy Corbyn and his team aren't popular with this one-time Labour voter.
And I'll never vote Labour again as long as they're in charge.
And so if Theresa May shows you that she's thinking of you,
Yeah,
do you think you could go her way?
yes, 100%. And I didn't think I'd ever say that.
Even in a place traditionally considered Labour's heartland, there are seats the Conservatives want to win. One of the Middlesbrough constituencies is high on the party's target list for the next general election. It's voters here the government needs to convince if it wants a real majority next time.
Well, the end of the rainbow was right over Redcar, and my thought was Redcar needs a pot of gold. Salt Ben and Bloom is a volunteer group. We've taken on many of the gardens that the council used to do.
In a region hard hit by cuts to public services, the Chancellor today talked up job creation in the northeast, but that hasn't filtered through round here.
There are people who are really struggling because of there are few jobs. A lot of them are part-time jobs, and a lot of them are low-paid jobs. They're not permanent jobs either.
So when you saw Theresa May on the steps of Downing Street or heard what she said, did you believe her?
I wanted to believe her, but the people of the North East believe that we're a neglected area, and Teesside especially feels that.
Who doesn't like hitting people with swords, to be honest? I enjoy it because it keeps me fit.
At Teesside Fencing Club, there are no cuts, strictly foil fencing here. The Chancellor talked of a resilient economy, despite the gloomy debt forecasts. But here, uncertainty is hitting home.
A bit concerned about, my job. There's cuts coming in where I work. They are very focused on kind of saving money because the income coming in has started to decline. We haven't noticed a massive drop yet, but it does seem to be kind of dropping. The freeze on petrol duty was a good idea. I think it'll help people. It'll help kind of stabilise the kind of slight increase in costs that we're starting to see come through on supermarkets and the luxuries and stuff like that.
I've been piercing for about 10 years now. Absolutely love it. I can't ever see myself having another job. For me, it's making someone happier in their own skin than they were before. It's so much fun.
Kim Hutchinson works at Skins and Needles Tattoo Studio in Middlesbrough. Like many of the artists in this clearly booming industry, she's self-employed, and it's not easy. So the Conservatives' latest attempt to target the just about managing, as they've dubbed them, resonates with her.
I think the Jams thing's quite accurate. Not struggling, but, not rolling in it. I think for a lot of people, we're in a bit of an uncertain time. So while people may feel I'm comfortable right now, but I don't know what's going to happen next month. Brexit has a lot to do with it. The exchange rate has made a huge impact on me. I'm self-employed. I buy a lot of things, body jewellery mainly, from America, from Europe. We are all keeping such a close check on exchange rates. We're trying to look for a slight drop in the exchange rate before we place an order, so we can save a little bit that way.
To be a world leader in 5G. That means a full 5G.
Back at the building site, Jonathan Skelton's endured almost an hour of financial announcements.
So we will invest over £1 billion in our digital infrastructure.
But Brexit and the debt forecasts don't worry him.
Because we're already in massive debt anyway.
But we're going to get in bigger debt.
Well, what difference is it going to make to us then? It's not going to make any difference. We knew it was going to be a long, drawn-out process.
As for the notion that the Brexit debt could cost almost the same as the amount the Leave campaign claimed we could get back and put into the NHS...
If we'd have stayed in the EU, we'd have continued to pay 350 million for X amount of years, a lot longer than what it's going to take to get over this 300 million. I think it's a small price to pay, to be honest with you, till we get back on our feet. We're a resilient country, we're resilient people. We'll get there, we'll fight, we always do. We're British.
Well, that was Katie Razzle up in Middlesbrough. Let's pick over the autumn statement now with Rupert Harrison, former Chief of Staff to George Osborne, now Managing Director at BlackRock, Stephen Glover from the Daily Mail and Polly Toynbee from The Guardian. Evening all. Let's take a look at the front page of the Mail, Stephen, because you've taken a very optimistic view of it. So much for Mr Gloomy. The elite said Brexit would spell apocalypse. Yesterday, an upbeat Chancellor predicted growth for 5 years. Pity about the terrifying debt. Are you feeling that optimistic about it? Did you think it was a sort of happy day?
Well, I think it was a reasonably happy day. I mean, the Chancellor has been very, very gloomy until almost the day before yesterday. I suspect the Prime Minister had been sitting on him, and he made an attempt to be as upbeat as possible. He spoke about a resilient British economy. He said there will be 500,000 new jobs by 2020. The growth figures which he outlined are not as good as they have been, but they're not too bad. 1.4 next year, 1.7 the year after, then back to about 2. He said that this year would be the fastest growing G7 economy. that all seems to add up to a reasonably good picture.
And so OBR, just to be clear, because I had wondered whether your line was going to be OBR, these are the enemies of the people who come up with these gloomy forecasts because this is the revenge of the expert. But that's not your... You kind of accept what the OBR is saying.
Personally, I don't. I mean, the OBR itself is doubtful about it, and it should be. I mean, the OBR has got things so consistently wrong, and it's more than usually difficult when it doesn't know the terms of Brexit. So they know it's going to be difficult.
Polly.
Well, it's a disaster. Everything that Project Fear said is more or less turning out to be right. I mean, you're right, nobody knows exactly how these forecasts are going, but the small c Conservative, the OBR, have been very, very cautious. They're assuming that we're still in the single market. They're assuming all sorts of things that are really quite positive. Nevertheless, this is going to mean £830 a year, on average, people are going to lose. Hammond himself said people didn't vote to be poorer, and I wonder whether when it sinks in, it'll take a while, probably not till towards the end of next year, people are going to say they never told us that we were going to vote to be poorer, and whether they're going to feel that it was a bad mistake. We have a budget that's really a fantasy, as you keep saying, Evan. The idea we're going to get 7% more cuts. Unthinkable. Nothing in the budget for health, nothing for social care, both of them falling over.
Nicely made. Good. This is the point to bring Rupert in, because Rupert, actually, those are the same spending projections that were there when you were there. Do you believe, moving on from Brexit, that we can now get borrowing down through those cuts in spending?
Well, of course we can. I mean, people made exactly the same statements back in 2010 that the government wouldn't be able to carry through the cuts in the last parliament. They did, and then won a majority of the next election. So I think we should aim off a little bit for that. I think the OBR were in quite a difficult position as a non-political body, but I think Robert Choate has handled it in a characteristically shrewd way. He's been extremely upfront about the impact that they see, but he's positioned himself in a slightly more optimistic position than the Bank of England and the average of the independent forecasters. So I think that he knows he's probably going to get a bit of an onslaught. But
Stephen, I mean, your paper does say pity about the terrifying debt. You clearly don't want us just to sit borrowing 3 or 4% of GDP forever and ever.
Well, of course not. Who does?
And what is your plan? I mean, what is your view as to what we should do to get out of this? It's just cut spending, is that all?
No, spending actually is slightly higher over the next 5 years than it was in the March budget, if you look at the figures carefully.
Indeed, because they feel they're not going to be able to do it, I think.
No, I mean, we don't know the terms of Brexit. I mean, I personally think that the 1.4% growth forecast for next year is unduly pessimistic. The fact we have 2.1 this year. If, for example, we grew by 2% next year and something like that the following year, then all these figures about having a hole of 59 billion will be just thrown into a completely different perspective. We're looking into the unknown. I think forecasters should have a bit of humility. I mean, we were, after all, promised in May by George Osborne that there would be an immediate and profound shock to the economy if people voted Brexit, and there would be an immediate recession. That's a direct quote. That hasn't happened. Far from it. The British economy at the moment is doing well.
Did the experts get it wrong, Rupert?
No, I absolutely agree about the need for humility, but I think we have to have humility on both sides. That clearly the short-term forecasts were wrong. There's been much more momentum in the economy than anyone anticipated.
If the short-term are wrong, the long-term are more likely to be wrong.
The early indications, as the OBR point out today, the early indications of the medium-term impact, investment intentions, inward investment, hiring intentions, those are starting to come off more in the way that was predicted. But it's incredibly early days, as the OBR say. They don't know what's going to happen. And
Stephen's plan is that he basically doesn't really believe the OBR figures, so that borrowing won't be so bad.
But it could be worse.
That's the point.
There's uncertainty on both sides.
It's
not actually true.
Of course, it could be worse, but not.
But it's quite likely at some point.
I want to come back to this point: are we basically a nation? We've got a structural deficit. We've had a structural deficit for sort of 10 years now. Are we a nation that is undertaxed, or are we a nation that is overspending?
We are indeed. We are a nation that is always saying it wants Swedish services on US tax rates. The plan that you and George Osborne have hatched, which you haven't quite reached yet, is to keep the size of the state shrinking, wanting to get it down to 35, 36%. It is still in the books on the trajectory that way, just going to take rather longer.
But the numbers aren't anything like that, by the way. I mean, the spending went up to about 45, 46% of GDP. It's come down. It's still above 40% of GDP.
No, 40% now.
Which is above the long-term average. So the idea that this is some catastrophic level of spending is ludicrous.
Is for it to go down and to get down to about 35, 30, eventually, it doesn't quite say when. The idea is that we should cut and cut again, a country where our public services have become thinner and shabbier and more wretched. The idea that you could take 12 billion in benefit cuts off the lower half, I cannot understand why you did that. Why, if you wanted to make those cuts, didn't you take it off the broader shoulders? Why did it have to come off the most hard-working, low-paid
The deficit reduction plan over the last 6 years actually has been spread extremely broadly across the population, and actually the richest people are paying the most towards it.
The very richest.
But I think at a time where businesses around us are transforming the way we live our lives, transforming the way they do things, this defeatism about the idea that government can't do anything like that is just ludicrous, and we see it in some areas of government that we're making enormous...
But it's not government, it's people.
Most of the cuts to come are in
hard.
departmental spending. They're in savings in the way we do things.
I'm sorry, but
it's evidently possible to do
why
that.
Take 12 billion off things like universal credit that was meant to help working people, and instead of that, you've cut corporation tax, which was in your plans.
Let me go back to Stephen.
Tax by 12 billion.
I want Stephen to sort of arbitrate in this, because the reason why public spending has been so difficult to cut is because demographics, health spending, pensioners are making it very hard to get the state down to where it was in the 1950s. Yes. What would be your plan if they have to find more cuts in spending? The triple lock, the pensioner triple lock?
I have no idea what the government should do in that eventuality. I hope it won't be necessary.
That could be the motto for the day, actually.
It is a fantasy budget. It quite plainly is impossible. It is an impossible budget. None of it is actually true or going to happen.
We have to leave it there. Thanks all very much indeed.
Welcome back to the Press Preview, where we're taking a look at the morning papers with documentary maker and journalist Jenny Kleeman and executive editor of Conservative Home, Mark Wallace. And so we turn our attention to the autumn statement this afternoon from Philip Hammond, and a wide variety of different takes on it on the front pages.
Indeed, and The Sun unusually manages to get both takes on it on the same front page. On the left-hand side, the budget will get Britain in shape for the split from Brussels. On the right-hand side, £122 billion black hole in the coffers. And I think Philip Hammond had a pretty good outing. It was a bit of a sticky wicket, and he indulged himself in taking a bit of revenge on his predecessor for leaving him some of these financial difficulties, perhaps. But I think he did a pretty good job of it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there were some, you called it a sticky wicket. I mean, £122 billion hole is a lot more borrowing to be done, given that the books were supposed to be balanced, weren't they?
Well, I think what this, his autumn statement showed, this is definitively the end of the Osborne era. We're kicking the idea of balancing the books into the long grass, or at least into the next Parliament. And also, I mean, this figure that a lot of the papers have looked at, this idea that the cost of Brexit is going to be £60 billion worth of extra borrowing.
There it is on the front of the Guardian.
Over the next 5 years. That figure is it's debatable. You could say we're getting back £350 million a week from not being. Anyway, I'm not going to make that facetious comment.
That's also in the same document. They write it down in black and white.
Yes. Well. All of these projections, they are projections, and they are kind of pie in the sky. What is not pie in the sky is there is going to be reduced growth and increased borrowing, and also that 2017 is going to be a tough year for everybody. Prices are going to go up. We are all going to feel the pinch. So there are stormy waters ahead. You could see us as boldly sailing through those stormy waters if you're someone who is very happy by the idea of Brexit, or you could see this as the Guardian does, as a £60 billion black hole.
Well, yes, and so there's the 60 billion figure, there's the increased borrowing, and the obviously increasing debt all the time, and yet the Daily Mail has said so much for Mr Gloomy. They put a very positive spin on it.
Well, I think it's a positive spin on it, but there are good reasons to be somewhat sceptical about some of these projections. When we're told that growth is down, well, growth is down compared to what the OBR was predicting before the referendum campaign. Suddenly, when the referendum campaign came along, George Osborne was launching Treasury forecast after Treasury forecast, predicting we'd be in recession right now. We are not. Next year, the Treasury predicted would be somewhere between 0 growth and minus 0.2%. Now they're saying plus 1.4. Now, that might be give with one hand, take with the other on behalf of the Treasury. And really what you take away from it is take all of these projections with a pinch of salt when they come from people who always get them wrong.
Well, surely what we have learnt since the election of 2015 is that everybody who makes projections always gets them wrong. The pollsters get them wrong. If if a year ago, when around this time a year ago we were in Parliament debating whether or not Donald Trump should be banned from the UK because of what he said about banning Muslims from the US, if you could have said that we would be in the situation that we are now, most people would have roundly laughed. I guess it is the OBR's job to make these predictions, though, and the fact that they are so consistently wrong is worrying. But the fact is nobody knows what's going to happen. Nobody has any idea at all. It's a great thing that we're not in recession. It's a great thing that the fear that was whipped up over what might happen with Brexit hasn't come to pass. Yet still, these are completely this is totally uncharted territory, and nobody knows what's going to happen.
Let's take a look inside the Mail, because there's a story that you've picked out about at one moment during the afternoon. It's actually when the Shadow Chancellor is speaking, is it?
It is, yes. This is during John McDonnell's big moment, because obviously when the budget gets launched, the Shadow Chancellor doesn't respond. That's the Leader of the Opposition's job, Jeremy Corbyn. So the autumn statement is really John McDonnell's big moment. It's being taken away from him by the Chancellor abolishing the autumn statement. And here he is, holding forth with all of the MPs behind him, looking at their phones. And one thing you were saying about things that's hard to predict, it's very hard to predict that Philip Hammond will be more exciting than John McDonnell at today's debate. But McDonnell managed it. Maybe he's nervous after last year's Little Red Book throwing
I suppose
fiasco.
they had been sitting there for a while as well by the time that he got to stand up and do his bit.
It's an unfortunate image, certainly.
Now, we referred to sherry-fuelled Chancellor just before the break, and perhaps we should explain why, because this is inside the Daily Mail, and it's part of their headline there. My sherry-fuelled snog with long-haired hippie Chancellor. I don't think this is recent, is it?
No, and as Kiss and Tails go, this is pretty desperate stuff. But what they have got is somebody who had a snog with Philip Hammond many years ago when he was a long-haired goth. I first looked at this picture and saw Philip Hammond is circled here in the top right, and I thought maybe that was the woman doing the kiss and tell, but no, that is the Chancellor, Philip Hammond, just with long hair, and apparently he was very sexy, fun-loving, long-haired. He was an excellent kisser. Details I would rather not know, but hey.
And it was very hip at the time, of course, that look. So, and on that note, we shall leave it. And Mark, you're probably dying to comment on that.
So many things, but you don't want to hear them.
We are out of time, I'm afraid.
I've been getting